welcome both to those on screen and who will be on screen, and to those watching their screens. The purpose of today's webinar is twofold. First, in a drill down on one of the issues that's clearly incredibly important across the globe, which is global migration, which is why we pulled together the particular panelists that we have, and why we have made available to people, and hundreds have watched The Long Walk of Carlos Guerrero, Joseph Mathews' feature-length film. The other reason we're gathering this morning is to give everybody who's participating at least 1 hour of not thinking about the American election, which I suspect all of us need, because the day's going to be a long one. I hope everyone watched Joseph's film. Joseph, I got to congratulate you. It's fabulous.
Oh, thank you, Alan.
It deserves as broad an audience as it can get, both because it's a wonderful piece of work, but also an incredibly important topic that people need to think deeply about. That said, I should tell everyone that Joseph, in addition to being an accomplished cinematographer, is also an important part of the Tällberg team that produces our podcast every week, New Thinking for a New World. Wouldn't happen, neither the New Thinking nor hopefully the New World, without Joseph. I also want to welcome Andrew Selee, who is managing director of the, or director rather, of the Migration Policy Institute.
Yep.
I wrote down the Mexico Policy Institute, which is, I knew that was wrong. The Migration
Policy.
Our
past life, Alan, together.
I know. Well, I was about to say, we've known each other for way too long over things Latin American and things Mexican, back from the Council of the Americas, American Society days. But at Woodrow Wilson, Andrew now is director of the Migration Policy Institute, and in that capacity is one of the leading experts, not just in the United States, but globally on these issues. Andrew, thank you for agreeing to join us today, and more importantly, for agreeing to manage the conversation over the next hour. Very much appreciated. Over to you.
Okay, great. Well, great to be with you, and thank you, Alan, for organizing this event. And let me add praise to Joseph's film, which is extraordinary. And I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. Very powerful film. And Joseph, let me just open by asking, why did you make this film? I mean, you've made films about different issues. The border is one of the issues you followed, so I know it's not your first time venturing to the U.S.-Mexico border, but you have focused on other things in your career. You have a broad-ranging set of interests. What brought you back to making a film about migration at the U.S.-Mexico border?
Well, I've always the germ, you can say, like, the idea came to me when I was doing my documentary Crossing Arizona in the mid-2000s. And so while making the film, I experienced a lot, and I met a lot of people who were about to make the journey. I met people on both sides of the border who were facing this story on a personal level, whether they were ranchers, whether they were border patrol agents, whether they were human rights activists, and even the migrants themselves. So this idea about, I experienced a lot surrounding the migration, but not the journey itself, in a way, because I would meet like people about to make the journey. And then on the other side, you will come across like all people, the reality of the death in the desert and all those, like really gruesome things that kind of can happen to people. And so I experienced that, but I never went along with anybody's journey, because everybody's journey is different. So this idea about doing a very, very linear kind of like a narrative, very simple narrative, kind of like, I thought about that then, but then it finally became a reality many, many years later. Yeah.
That's great. Why does this topic fascinate you? And why does it fascinate us so much in this country and around the world? We will get to talking about this as a global issue as we go. But, as you said, it is a personal story, right? Immigration is a personal story, whether it's crossing through the desert or coming in on a student visa. I mean, moving from one country to another, changing where you live, changing the culture and the nation that you where you call home is a deeply personal experience, and for everyone it's different. It's harder for some than others, obviously. What brought you to this, and why is this such a big issue in our body politic these days?
Yeah, that's a very interesting
And
question.
it's not totally irrelevant to your own personal experience as well, I should add, right?
Right,
Although you did not
exactly.
exactly cross through the desert, but I mean, but immigration is, you and I each have in different ways immigration stories. I mean, you certainly have one that, but it is something that affects so many of us personally in our lives.
Yes, absolutely. How I came to the story was there was a New York Times article that I noticed like way back when about like people dying in the desert and the rising death toll. That immediately it just caught my attention. I was like, wow, like people like dying when they're crossing the border, just like seeking, a better life, seeking something which maybe like fleeing danger, whatever it is that drives people to make this very arduous and risky journey. And so during the time, I also heard about the sanctuary movement, which happened like in the 80s. And I read about John Fife and how during the civil wars in Central America, there was this group of people in Tucson who started the sanctuary movement, who would like go to the border and literally like help people who were fleeing the wars in Central America to come to the U.S. And since they were part of all these like churches, they would like give them sanctuary in the churches, and then that became the sanctuary. So I had read about that, and then I read the story of the New York Times, like made me go to the border for the first time, and then what I experienced there was like something very not just like personal, but very moving, like, and I even my first day I was out on the border. I remember like going out with Humane Borders, Mike Wilson, who is actually in the film. He plays himself as the Tohono Native American human rights, the volunteer. So Mike was at that time, he was on a solo mission to stop the number of people dying in the Tohono O'odham reservation. And so he would every Saturday he would load his pickup truck with water and go out into the desert and put up water for where people were. So Humane Borders were also like mapping where people were dying. So Mike would follow that map in a way and put out water where they had actually found, because there were kind of, you can say, like established like migrant trails. And he started putting out water. And so I followed him the first day. I went out with him. And we came across a man who was like walking for like many days, and his water, like, so he had a jug of water, which was like down to like very little. So the story that happened to him, something that happens all the time, like he crossed with a group of people, and then the border patrol came, and then everybody, dispersed, which happens in this movie as well, which is inspired by his story. So everybody dispersed, and he was on his own all of a sudden. He found himself alone in the desert, and he had no idea where he was. And then luckily we ran into him, and he was just, so he told us a story of like why he crossed the border, like, so because he was from Hidalgo in Mexico, and he had, run out of money. His wife needed surgery. So people said, hey, if you go to the US, you can find work and you can get over your financial issues right away, So that was his very personal, immediate kind of like a motivation. And I found his story to be like so powerful. And that happened to be the first day, I was there. And so, from then on, it became, spent like 3 years like making the film and experienced so much, like I said, about migration and what's happening on the US-Mexico border on a very personal level.
That's great, actually. What did you learn when you were making this film? Did you learn anything new as you were?
You're talking about the new film or the Crossing Arizona?
Well, the Long Walk of Carlos Guerrero. So as you're making this film, I mean, what did you learn that you didn't already know from your prior film?
Well, in this one, like I did not learn much because so that's the thing between a documentary and narrative, because a narrative it's almost like everything's like set up in advance, right?
Yeah.
So you go there and you've written the story, and then you have actors. It's a whole different experience than making a documentary where everything is a learning process, because you kind of like put yourself in a situation and you learn so much more because you're kind of experiencing things as you go along. But this one is like more of a setup, like everything's kind of like set up. so that you go and shoot. But at the same time, you're kind of like scouting locations. You're going to like new places that I hadn't been before, and then yeah, and also like working. So the film has like a lot of people who are like not actors, right? They're actually like, so everybody you see in the Samaritans who are out there looking for Carlos, like in the movie, they're actually Samaritans, and that's what they do. You know, they go out for people in the desert. So I had the opportunity to actually like, you know, interact with all of them, and also like shoot at the Southside Presbyterian Church, which was where the sanctuary movement actually started. So the film kind of like ends there. So for me, it was really cool to kind of like go back to, you know, the sanctuary movement, the place where the sanctuary movement was born, to kind of like finish the film. Yeah.
Well, neat. That's great. That's fabulous, actually. Why is, by the way, everyone who has joined us, thank you for being with us. We are going to use the Q&A function for questions. So if you have questions for Joseph, and then we will go into a panel discussion in a few minutes. And if you have questions for the other panelists as well, you can type your questions in the Q&A function, and we will read them out as best we can. We may group them a bit as we go. So please feel free to use that. So Joseph, and I see some questions are popping up already. Great, from the Philippines. Good to see you're with us, and looks like we have a very international group with us. So Joseph, why is this a complicated topic? So you've gotten to know migrants. I mean, especially when you were doing the documentary, you've been on the field, but also why is this? I mean, this is an election this is an issue that could decide the election in the U.S. one way or another, and I think it could go either way. By the way, because I think there's people who are very concerned about border control who are gravitating towards Donald Trump, but there are people who are concerned about border control, but also concerned about the idea of deporting people in this country who may gravitate towards Vice President Harris. So there, this, I don't think we know yet how this will play out in the election, but clearly it is an issue that has struck a chord and has been used by campaigns in different ways. Why is this a complicated issue?
Yeah, I my personal opinion is it's like highly politicized. It's like an easy thing for people, for politicians to kind of latch onto. I have a very interesting anecdote about. So when I was doing Crossing Arizona, we were following this this person who was like a right-wing militia, almost like his name was Chris Cox, and his whole thing was like he wanted to like stop people from crossing. So he would like have his group of people, and they were all armed, and they would go out into the desert and look for migrants crossing, and then they would stop them and then call up the Border Patrol and ask them to kind of, come and pick up these people. So this he was doing. So I followed him, and nobody like knew about him, right? So when he first started, I followed him for like maybe like a couple of months, and then kind of observe and shoot like what he was doing, what he was up to. But then the weirdest thing happened, like around probably like a year later, I was in New York and I was watching CNN, and all of a sudden, this man, Chris Simcox, who nobody knew about, was suddenly on CNN. He was on Lou Dobbs, and immediately like the whole story, right? So the film kind of like it was almost like the tipping point where nobody was like talking about border and migration to being this like national thing, right? And people took like very strong sides, and all of a sudden, people from other parts of the country, and Chris Simcox immediately became a national celebrity, and he started the Minuteman movement, where people from all over the country, he mobilized this. So there's also like this thing about the internet at that time, So one of the first real movements in a way that the right-wing media kind of helped establish and mobilize people to actually do something which they thought was important, which was like going to the southern border and putting up a blockade, against migration. So I think it's a topic that can be personal, I don't know, in some way, that people feel like the sense of like, oh, other people are coming in to take whatever they have, or something, it's something like that. And it can be it can be like an emotional thing that people can use to kind of for a political purpose. It taps into some kind of like an emotional thing in a person, I guess. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear here.
No, it does. Yeah. No, and I think it taps into notions of identity, about who we are, about order and control. I mean, it taps different parts of the psyche of lots of different people, right?
Yeah.
But it also touches on the humanitarian side. I mean, you've been out. So what motivates the people who are involved in the sanctuary movement and in the groups that are helping migrants and people like you were just talking about Mike Wilson. I mean, what gets them to be involved? We're not necessarily migrants themselves, or at least not migrants who came across the border.
Right. I mean,
In the case of Mike, he could argue that the border crossed the Tohono O'odham people, actually. Right. But yes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think like there is like a singular view. Everybody has like different motivations in terms of like, why they are actually out there, like doing humanitarian work. But for a lot of people, from at least my understanding, is that it's a very basic thing that nobody should die. You know what I mean? Nobody should die in the desert. It's as simple as that. Like you can be fleeing something, you can be in flight you can be risking your life for a very specific reason, or you might just be looking for a better life in some way or the other, but whatever reason people are crossing does not mean that they should be left to die without water, right? So it's like a very basic kind of like an instinct that a lot of those people I feel are trying to address.
Great. Let me see if we have any questions. We're gonna, by the way, Dilton from Kenya, good to have you with us. Abdus from Bangladesh, great to have you. Harriet from Milano, Italy. You have a question from Harriet from Milano who says she was wondering if Mr. Joseph has an experience of this kind or any relative or friends which inspired him to produce this movie. It was really your experience. It was really what you read and then going down and doing the documentary first.
Yes,
right?
yes. So, but this specific film is a homage to a friend of mine. So that's another interesting story that I would love to share. So the film is a homage to a friend of mine. His name is Carlos Garcia, and he was a chef in New York City. He was actually quite famous so he died unfortunately from cancer in 2015. And he was so I used to live near the restaurant. So I used to work at Leal, and he was Anthony Bourdain's assistant for many years. And then once Anthony left to do television, he became the executive chef at Leal. Since I used to live in the neighborhood, I used to go there once in a while, and then I met him for whatever reason, and then we used to hang out. We became friends, because I was doing this documentary, so I kind of like told him about like what I was doing, and then we just became friends. And he was telling me the story about like how he became, at that time he was this, kind of like almost like a celebrity chef in a way. Because of the television show, and Anthony really, like, he was in many episodes of the CNN, not the CNN show, the Food Network, No Reservations, or the one before that. So Carlos was telling me like he crossed the border when he was like very, very young, probably like 18 years old. And he started like as a dishwasher, right? In working in like New York City restaurants. And ultimately he became like the chef of this brasserie that everybody knew in the city. And so he was telling me that for a long time, almost like, so eventually he became, he got his papers and became, legal documents to work and everything. But for a long time, he was undocumented. And during the entire time he was undocumented, he could not go back to Mexico to see his parents, to see his family. So, which was like well over a decade, that he could not even, go back to Mexico. So that kind of something that I never really thought about. And so that's what motivated me to make the main character as a New Yorker going back, because most of the migration stories about people get crossing. So this is a story of a man who actually went back, and this is his journey back,
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. You made him a restaurateur. He went back, and then he's coming back again into the United States, right? He made that difficult decision to go back. For those that haven't seen the movie, Carlos Guerrero makes the difficult decision to go back to see his mother, who's terminally ill. And then he's coming back, and is where the journey really hits some rough edges on the way.
Right.
Rough edges would be an understatement. Gets into some very difficult situations and life-threatening situations on the way back. And by the way, this is not only people who've crossed the border. I mean, there was a New York Times story about another restaurateur who was actually Indian born, who came to the United States, Arjav Ezekiel, that came out back in August, who came with his family, overstayed their visa, and was quite successful. He's now legally present. He now has a green card and is a restaurant owner in Texas, and quite successful, but lived undocumented, unbeknownst to people. And one of his comments in the article is, it's very, let's see, actually, I have it here. People forget that everything they eat is likely to have been touched by somebody who didn't have papers. That if you look at the agricultural workforce, you look at, people who are in service industries, in grocery stores, in the food chain, certainly in restaurants, almost certainly some of the people who brought that food to you are people who are undocumented in the United States, who are deeply integrated in the country, who may have been here for many years, who may have American-born children or American-born siblings, who deeply integrated in the country, but actually know that they are in danger of being deported and are probably watching this election with some concern, by the way. So yeah, if it's okay with you, why don't we bring in our two other colleagues here? Oh, and good to have another colleague from Bangladesh and University of Nigeria. Wonderful, excellent. Two from Nigeria, it looks like. So we have a good, very international group of people, more from Nigeria. And let's dive into our two guests. So pleasure to invite May Bulman and Celina de Sola to join us for this conversation. Celina, who I've known for a while, is a really inspiring Salvadoran social entrepreneur. She is the co-founder and president of Glasswing International, which works in 15 countries, addressing the root causes and consequences of poverty and violence through public education, health, and community empowerment initiatives. And Glasswing is known for catalyzing unusual collaborations between governments, business, and community groups, and building a new culture of shared responsibility that fosters long-term sustainable change. And May Bulman is an award-winning investigations editor who I just met a little while ago at Lighthouse Reports, where she coordinates teams of journalists and carries out her own in-depth reporting on investigations with a focus on borders and migration. She was previously the social affairs correspondent for The Independent in the United Kingdom, and she gained recognition for her reporting on asylum and migration, and she's received multiple awards for her reporting on migration and modern-day slavery. So welcome to both of you. Great to have both of you here. Tell me, why is this an issue that persists in our public debate and has become such a source of controversy and tension? And what do we do about it? So whichever of you wants to go first, May, why don't you dive in, and then we'll go with Celina.
Sure, yeah, that's hello everyone, first of all, and just to say, Joseph, I thought the film was really excellent. I watched it the other day. Yeah, really powerful. But yeah, it's a tough question. And the interesting thing is, I think that actually, the way the issue of illegal migration is portrayed in the media, and often by politicians in both America and the UK, where I'm based, and also across Europe, really, is that there's been this massive surge, and it's at completely unprecedented levels, and it's a huge crisis, and there's like this kind of existential panic around it. But actually, if you look at the data and the hard facts, that's not strictly the case. I mean, there's the way that people have been migrating has changed, and there have been more and more rules built, whether that be physical rules or kind of symbolic rules to do with policy and the restricting of legal routes and so on. So it's for those reasons really that more people are having to cross borders in an irregular or illegal manner. So I always just, that's something that frustrates me, is that it's being blown up into this huge crisis, and actually the fact is that there aren't the numbers are not. I mean, I'm talking mainly about the UK now because that's what I'm mainly focused on, but the numbers are not actually that huge, and many people in the UK have never actually come across an asylum seeker in their life. So, you know, but despite that, so much of the political debate is around, you know, illegal asylum seekers coming to the UK. Well, in practice, it's not something that actually touches many people's lives. But yeah, I think as Joseph mentioned earlier, it's become a very politicized issue, and politicians kind of on all sides, maybe not on all sides, but certainly both in America and the UK, the two main parties are kind of tapping into it and you know, kind of making it into this huge issue, be that because they're worried that if they don't, they won't get the votes, or because they want to kind of distract from other issues. But yeah, it's certainly become a very politicized topic, and the rhetoric around it is, you know, kind of whipping up this frenzy of panic, when in fact the fact is it's not a huge threat to our society.
Celina, how do you see this? I mean, why is this a big issue? And also, what are you able to do about it? Because I know you've been working very actively on actually alternatives to people taking dangerous journeys that give them an ability to think that they have a right not to migrate, right? That they have a right to be able to stay where they are. So.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And thanks for inviting us on this panel. I think, you know, I agree with what May said. I also think it's interesting, the difference, right, between Europe and Latin America, the United States. We're here, just like you said 2 seconds ago, Andrew, like almost everything we eat has, you know, there's been some sort of involvement from someone who's come to the country recently, which I think underscores the economic role, the role of people who are arriving in the US and contributing to the economy in productive ways. And I think also, and I imagine this is also happening in Europe, I think there's this strange kind of direct, immediate assumption and correlation made between someone who's coming to seek asylum and crime, right? All of a sudden it's like, oh, you know, immigrants are equal criminals, or so it's just kind of this narrative that builds on itself in all these negative ways when it's not factual, and that's a whole other conversation, right, about what is fact and what isn't. And I think those of us who read the data and read the statistics know this, but it's also hard to convince people when there's so many different sources of news and data. And I'll say, and just coming back to something really simple, I think it's easy for us, for human beings to forget quickly that you're arbitrarily born into circumstances. And I think somehow we just get on these like really negative and destructive conversations and rhetoric around immigrant populations. Another thing you said earlier is that the United States is founded on immigration, right? So people forget quickly that perhaps their grandparents were immigrants pretty recently. And we also forget that there's really no difference between any of us, except that we were born and we were dealt a good deck of cards or we weren't, right? And then that would naturally imply that we all have the same right to be able to access opportunities and to have the conditions in which we can thrive. And sadly, that's not the case, right? I was talking to somebody yesterday from Latin America, and they were telling me that they're like, no, you know, we can't have all these people leaving our countries because our labor force is leaving, right? Because there's this perception that we're using all these people. And on the one hand, you know, like you said, Andrew, I'm always like, you know, people have the right to stay home if that's what they choose and if they can access opportunity. But then on the other, it's like, you can't also keep people working for less than minimum wage in terrible conditions. So I think there's just a lot, we have to reflect on that, what cards were dealt and what that means and how. And I think one of the questions on the chat is like what we can do. I'm in New York right now, and in Latin America, we work with young people on providing the conditions that people can thrive. And a lot of organizations are doing that. And then here in New York, we work with immigrant youth, and we ask them, we're like, what do we need to do to create the conditions for you to thrive, as opposed to being prescriptive? We ask a lot of these recently arrived immigrant high school kids. And I think that's important to always go back to people to say, how can I help? And I think how else can we help is just get involved, volunteer. And I think that means a lot, because aside from what you're doing volunteering, you're also sending a message. And then even bringing people along, instead of trying to convince people, just bring people along and be like, can you help me? I'm going to go translate or whatever, or help people out. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work that we can all do, but I think that
now there may also, let me be the contrarian here a little bit on a day of elections in the United States, which is to say there may be something about the image of chaos. There are some people, I think, who dislike immigration, either because they think it's tied to crime and economic changes, to which it isn't tied, right? Or at least their own economic misfortune. I mean, because the studies tell us immigrants in the United States are much less likely to commit crime than the native born, including undocumented immigrants. They are generally a complement to American workers and make us more productive as a country, and actually help people stay employed, Americans stay employed, as well as being employed themselves. And so there's a lot of good things from this, but that doesn't mean people understand that, right? It doesn't mean people in situations of economic and social precarity don't look at what's going on and say, I don't know who to blame, but it could be these folks, right? So I think that may be one part. And there's certainly, I think, as Joseph was saying, I mean, this does also, immigrants change the country. Immigrants are changed by their experience coming to a new country, but they also change the country where they arrive. That's a good thing, right? I mean, that's, why Joseph can go to a restaurant run by a Mexican chef, and which is not a Mexican restaurant, but is run by Mexican. We have this sort of diversity. So you can get fusion food. Our language changes, ideas are introduced, but that also is scary, right? I mean, most people don't live in lives of mobility. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that people react to immigration more strongly in places where there's less history of immigration, right? Where it's less familiar to people. But then finally, there's this big group that I think reacts to chaos and to this idea that people are coming. There are finally people coming, but in the right way. These are large numbers. Who let them in? And so part of the question, I don't know we can deal with the first two. The first one, you can try and inject facts. It doesn't always work. And certainly narratives, I think, matter, right? I mean, who can sort of, to May's point, political leaders play a big role in misinformation, but can play a big role in right information as well. I'm not sure we can do much about the identity politics, but that's a minority, and big minority. We can do something about order, right? And creating immigration policies that allow people to come in regular ways, and creating development policies that give people opportunities to choose to go or stay, to see that they have other opportunities other than migrating. So I don't know, Celina, you've been working on some of this on the development side. Do you want to talk about that? I mean, how do you give people at least opportunities to stay? Right. They may still stay, of course. But.
Yeah, I mean, we work with young people. We've been working with young people, school-aged and teenagers. And I think what we're seeing is that when you, we're kind of adapting right now this model, like it's like an AmeriCorps model, but in Central America, and it fuses community service, which is great because your role in the community changes. Perhaps people in Tegucigalpa stigmatize, there's still a lot of stigma around youth. So your role as a change maker, so to speak, kind of changes the way you see yourself and the way the community sees you, but we're also providing a stipend. So it's a first, it's essentially a first work experience too. So it helps you also build your resume, your positioning. And what we see is when young people have these opportunities, the safety, of course, but also access to economic opportunity, and also that mística, we say in Spanish, that positioning where young people are seen as an asset and not a liability. There's something really powerful about that. And the thing is, there's so many models and ways to do this around the world, and it's just figuring out what works. And I think for us, it's been important to keep going back to young people and ask them, right? And because things do change, their perception changes, and we can't assume, for example, in agriculture, so many young people work in agriculture, or their parents did, but they don't want to. So just we're like, oh, well, you can work, in the chicken farm, or you can work in the coffee farm. And we have to be also understanding about the fact that young people are aspirational. They have all kinds of information that they can access about what's happening all over the world. So it's not so easy that you can just convince someone to take, less than minimum wage to do something that they're not excited about because you're 16 or 18, just like any other 16 or 18-year-old. So I think it's finding that. How do you change that? And also aspirational thinking is really important. Can I see opportunities where I live? And I'm sure in context in Europe, right? If you're leaving from, Yemen, if you're leaving from all the Afghanistan, all these countries that you really don't see any opportunities for yourself. I think any of us would do the same, or if our child was in danger, or if we're in danger in our home or in the community. So it's really thinking about what we need to do to create these conditions. And it's not as easy in some contexts as it is in others.
Yeah. May, let me come back to you on this. I mean, in the UK, since Celina, opened the discussion on Europe as well. I mean, it is, you have lots of people coming, but in the UK, the focus is really on people coming across the channel on boats, right? I mean, it's the small number of people you referenced coming in, but the UK actually has become an incredible immigration society. It was not, I mean, the US, we could say, has always been, in addition to people such as the Tono Odom, who have been here forever, well, at least for tens of thousands of years at this point, 18 to 20,000 years, you have people who, the vast majority of Americans trace their heritage, and often very recently, at least some part of their heritage, to immigration, right? That wasn't always true in the UK. I mean, yes, you could go back further and you would see that as well, but it is true today, right? I mean, I'm fascinated by the last two leaders of the Conservative Party have been people of recent immigrant heritage, right? I mean, that's the Conservatives, right? This is not Labour. The last premier of Scotland, at one point, I think the premier of Scotland and Northern Ireland, right, are people with recent immigrant history. I mean, you don't have to go very far to find the imprint of this, but the focus is really on the boats. How do you see that contradiction? I mean, is there more comfort with the sort of changing pattern of British society as it becomes a more visibly immigrant society, or is that also part of the pushback here?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because you're right. I mean, like, the UK is historically a very tolerant society, and back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of immigrants were invited here to help rebuild after the war. So, then it was kind of seen as a great thing. But then kind of in decades that followed, that started to change. And now, you're right in pointing out a lot of, that the new and former Conservative leader were people of colour, and the previous, I think, 3 or 4 Home Secretaries, which is obviously the role that is in charge of how the UK deals with migration and migration policy and asylum, have been people of colour. But actually,
the Labour mayor of London.
Yes,
I mean,
indeed,
you don't have to go very far to see people in prominent role and in business now, and increasingly in other parts.
Indeed, yeah, and obviously that's such a great thing. But it's interesting that actually that hasn't translated into more understanding of, I guess, more acceptance of helping asylum seekers and welcoming refugees to the UK. I think there's in the UK now, there's this real sense of I mean, racism certainly still exists, but given people of colour being in these senior roles, I suppose there's an acceptance of certainly people who are not white being in senior roles, but then actually there's been an increase in sort of hostility towards people who are not, well, first, are not white, and second, don't, or I guess are undocumented migrants. But even then, our refugee policy at the moment in the UK is very harsh. I mean, it's very restrictive. We're not welcoming a lot of refugees at all, even compared to 5 years ago. It's way fewer. And yeah, as you pointed out, the small boats is currently the big issue, which is, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but it's kind of ironic because actually the number of people crossing on small boats is a tiny fraction of the overall number of migrants coming to the UK each year. So like I said, it doesn't really touch people's lives. I mean, obviously these people need to be housed, and that's a whole issue of the massive delays in our asylum decision-making system, and also asylum seekers not being allowed to work. So therefore you have to put them up because they can't legally earn any money. So there's a very flawed system in itself. But I think, it's interesting that, although we appear to be so tolerant, I guess that doesn't translate into our migration policies being tolerant and kind of progressive and welcoming. And in some ways, I don't know, it's an interesting one. It's kind of interesting that, in the Conservative, there is, some say that the Conservatives purposely put people of color in the Home Secretary role, because the Conservatives introduced some really hostile policies, and it was almost like, you know, that makes it seem a bit less terrible that they were doing that. But I don't know. But yeah, for sure, you know, while we may appear to be this tolerant society, in some ways we are, in some respects, but at the same time we've really become a lot less tolerant when we're talking about people who aren't coming via kind of legal routes. And the reason why I guess there are so many a number of people coming via these irregular routes is that we don't actually have the legal routes have started to shut down. So this, you know, that's part of the reason for that as well.
Although there are a lot of legal routes to get to the United States or to the UK and parts of Europe, but they're not necessarily accessible to everyone, right? Now, is there a difference between legal and undocumented or irregular migration? I mean, let me ask that to whoever wants to answer it, because, I mean, even, you know, today we don't know how the US election is going to end, but there's a 50-50 chance that someone who is the daughter of two immigrants could be elected. She could also lose, and that could be part of why she loses, but I mean, among other things. But you know, but it is, you know, it is notable. I mean, you know, as we're having this conversation, people are out voting, and a lot of Americans are voting for someone who is, in fact, makes claim to be very cognizant of both her Indian and Jamaican heritage, and you know, being both a Black woman in the United States, but also have, you know, come from an immigrant family. And it is deeply you know, I'm not sure that most Americans are necessarily anti-immigrant, but I do sense that most Americans are really concerned about the border. And in fact, all the polls back that up, right? Americans are favorable. And I think something similar holds true in the UK. It holds true in some other countries. Not to say there aren't people who are hostile to immigrants, period, right? Because those folks do exist, by the way. They're not a tiny number. But there is sort of a big center of people who are comfortable with migration, may in fact themselves be migrants, right? Or married to migrants or children of migrants, but are concerned about people arriving illegally. I don't know. Does anyone want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I just feel there is a huge mismatch in terms of because I just want to rephrase it. I feel the people who can actually travel freely is such a minority in this world today, right? It is a privilege bestowed upon people, depending on whether you come from a rich country or coming from a wealthy background, right? Those are the only people who can travel anywhere. Everybody else, it's almost impossible to go anywhere legally. That's what it is. Even to get a visa to come to the US, even to get a visit visa, somebody is poor, it's almost impossible, right? And so when you have a situation where the legal routes are so limited, then it becomes very easy for the criminal organizations to fill in that void. It's as simple as that. Because if people were even given like some kind of like a temporary way of like coming into the country where there were like more slots open for people, I think people would happily take it. But we're in a situation where nobody wants to do that, right? Like neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party wants to actually have some kind of reform and be open to a way where we can actually allow people to come in through legal routes.
You know, one thing that I noticed, and when I do go back and forth between Latin America and the US, a lot of people would like to do that. They'd like to come during the season, work, generate income, and go home. So it's interesting. You know, I think when you have to leave because there's insecurity, whether you're in, you know, whatever part of the world you're in, like you're desperate to leave, right? And I don't think there's much you can do about that. But I think identifying more ways to allow people to work. The thing is, it's complicated, right? The filling out of all the forms, the time it takes, and depending on what your conditions are in your home community, sometimes you don't have the time, sometimes sometimes you save up and you hire coyote, like a trafficker, and you know you're going to do it, but sometimes you just have to leave. And we've seen both often, and a lot of times it does happen relatively suddenly. I mean, you can't wait a year or two to get the permit. And at the same time, there are companies, you know, in agriculture, they need workers, or the cruise industry. There are all these industries that need workers. So it's, I think it's tricky. And I feel like that would, of course, make it so much better, because people do actually, if they can, if there's enough safety, I think they would be interested in being able to go home. So that kind of freedom of movement is important. And I do want to say, I think there are a couple of questions that I think are interesting to mention in the chat, and one of them is that there isn't really conversation being had. I think both Fundación Comparte and Dulal asked about persons with disabilities, and the implications on that, and persons on the move with disabilities. And I think that's a huge conversation, and a huge challenge, and perhaps opportunity also, that we need to be talking about a lot more, when we think about the kind of the formal and informal ways to move. So I think that's something that's really important. And given climate change, indeed, I have no doubt, and I think none of us who look at this issue, that's going to keep worsening. There are going to be more people that do need to leave because of climate. So it's like hurry up and wait, you know, and it's like we're taking the scenic route to a fire somehow, right? It's like the fire truck is taking some weird route to address this issue, which is a fire. So I think we need all heads together for this, for sure.
So you have on one hand increasing pressures driven by climate, right? Sometimes by conflict as well. But on the other hand, you actually have changing labor markets in a lot of these countries. I mean, this is true, you know, there's a lot of evidence that actually the cycles of people across the US border follow more labor demand in the United States than anything else, right? That we're a population that's growing older. The same thing is certainly true of many countries in Europe as well, East Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, even parts of Latin America. Actually, some larger economies are Chile, Brazil are starting to gray. I mean, this is Barbados, you know, so that there is an actual demand for labor. But if we don't connect these with legal pathways, then the incentives are there for people to move in forms that are considered illegal, right? That are going to follow regular routes instead. So that becomes a really critical conversation. But even when you create legal pathways, really hard in the US, although actually the Biden administration's kind of done it for some groups in interesting ways. But we've actually seen Italy, Spain, and Germany recently pass labor mobility laws that allow people to come and work for periods of time, actually for the most part, for permanent periods of time. But they're very hard to actually put, because they have labor needs. I mean, and they recognize this, and it's high skilled, but it's also lower skilled and middle skilled. They're pretty broad, but it's actually hard to even make it happen, right? Because, you know, where are you going to recruit people? Which employers have access to figure out how to recruit someone? You know, there's willing workers in lots of places. There's willing employers. Matching them is not always easy. Right. And then you get into requirements. You mentioned, Celina, the sort of people waiting for, you know, how do you get validated your chef, you know, credentials from your home country to be able to go and work in another country? These are often really burdensome. So even when the channels exist, they're sometimes hard. And then the recruiting pathways may not go to where you live. Right. So it may well be, even in the US, you see this in Central America a lot. Right. You know, there are actually people going as temporary workers, but they only recruit in certain areas. And so if you don't live in one of those areas, you will never be recruited, because there isn't really a way in to the pathways yet, unless you begin to think of those. So it is about creating legal pathways, but also making them work in a way that actually connects people who want to move with people who, or need to move with people who actually would like to be able to receive them, and in many cases employ them. Let's go to climate change, because I do think that's a big issue, and it's in the questions here. I mean, does anyone else want to dive in on the question of how climate intersects with other drivers of migration? And while others are jumping in, let me say, I do think the question of legal mobility matters. I do think that there will be pushback on people, whether or not we think it's a moral issue or a problem. I do think we should expect that there will be pushback when people show up in ways that do not fit within the legal system, and it will create noise that actually gets in the way of building legal pathways. So the more we get ahead of this and create legal opportunities for mobility, the better. We're sort of, you know, getting out ahead of what become the tricky political debates, but easier said than done. but climate is one of these other drivers, right? It's adding to conflict as one of these things. Joseph, May, you look like you want to dive in? Or am I putting you on the spot? You covered this when you're reporting. Dive in.
Well, yeah. Well, actually, I haven't. It's interesting. I haven't done loads on climate migration yet, but it definitely feels like it's something that is, only going to become a bigger issue, isn't it? And it, I mean, you know, we can't deny that in the coming decades, it's going to be more and more of a concern. And actually, countries are going to have to, like countries in the global north or the west, are going to have to really, you know, face the issue head on, because there's no getting away from it. And it feels like at the moment, you know, there's just all these attempts to like erect borders. And another thing that I think is interesting is, I mean, what was being said earlier about kind of the lack of legal routes. One thing to be said there is, I think that in, you know, maybe 50 years ago, there just weren't so many checks on people coming, like crossing borders. So, but actually there have always been people traveling for work, and it hasn't really caused an issue in the past. And like in Africa, for example, we recently, so Lighthouse Reports, the organization I work for, recently published an investigation into how the EU is giving North African countries a lot of money to try to stem the flow of migrants and refugees coming into Europe. So to like stop people from leaving North African shores, basically. And I think this, like, the thing that I learned in doing that was that actually people have been traveling from like the sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa for years and years, like going up to North Africa to find work and then going back home, and, you know, depending on the season and so on. But now more and more people, I mean, yeah, North Africa is becoming more hostile to people from sub-Saharan Africa. And so more people from sub-Saharan Africa are kind of then trying to cross through to Europe, but then they're being, like, basically with the what we found was that this EU money is being used to very violently, like, prevent people from leaving North Africa. So often they'll be just like bussed to the desert area, and they'll just be left in the desert with no food and water, and people dying as a result. Like really terrible stuff. But that's all to say that I think there's been this real effort, like increased effort to manage migration, where that wasn't happening so much before. There's all this money being spent on being paid by Western countries to private companies to like surveil the borders and to erect these fences and everything. So that just actually makes irregular migration way more visible than it used to be. Like it's always happened, right? But now it's just like a lot more obvious because there's this like obsession with managing and controlling the borders. But yeah, so on climate migration, I think that that's going to be when like Western countries have to actually accept that like just trying to keep people out and be like a kind of, you know, have these rules are going to keep everyone out, and this idea that you can actually keep people out, it's just going to completely, you know, they're going to have to accept that it's not going to work, because people actually can't stay living in the places they're living in. You can't just expect, like, I mean, this is just like a kind of, I don't know that this actually would come to pass, but like, say people coming to North Africa because they can't stay in sub-Saharan Africa because of climate issues, like you can't expect them people to just stay in the neighboring countries because like as they flee from areas due to climate change, because that's not going to be manageable for those countries. Like obviously, yeah, and the other thing which I think someone mentioned in the chat is that the global north, if you call it, we're the most responsible for climate change anyway. So like actually there's a duty there as well, to kind of help to manage the terrible impacts of that climate change. And, you know, I don't have an answer, but all I know is that we, like, yeah, the Western countries like the US, the UK are going to have to actually have serious conversations about this, and like, you know, make decisions eventually that will lead to actually accepting more people, and accepting that climate change is going to mean that, you know, more and more parts of the world become uninhabitable. And let's see what happens. But yeah, they're basically going to have to take some responsibility, aren't they?
I mean, it's interesting. There are some parts of the world where where mobility has led to less turmoil. I mean, I would say much of Africa, and East Africa and West Africa, not that there isn't any. I mean, there is some pushback. We have some people Nigeria and Ghana on this in this meeting. You know, there actually are mobility agreements both in ECOWAS and in the East African community. They don't work perfectly. I mean, they're sort of incompletely. There's actually two in two different ones actually in East Africa. But you know, there's been an attempt to create mobility among countries with similar levels of development, right? I mean, that I think we should assume is part of this. These agreements work well when countries feel like there isn't one country that's the pole. They've not worked as well in Southern Africa for that reason. Someone asked about South Africa. I mean, good people to read on South Africa: Caroline Kijato and Lauren Landau, among others. And there's a very good group of researchers around WITS, around the University of Witwatersrand, that does research on migration, actually across the continent, but especially in South Africa. South Africa has huge pushback on migration right now. So this doesn't always, but South Africa is a draw, much like the United States is, like the UK is. You know, it is one of those countries. Latin America and the Caribbean, I mean, you know, I have to say that 2.8 million Venezuelans have moved to Colombia in the past, you know, since 2016. Large number of people. It's created some pushback, but it's not become politicized, right? I mean, in fact, you know, there's about 6.5 million Venezuelans living throughout Latin America, mostly in South America, and you know, it is a political issue in Chile and Peru, but less elsewhere. And the politics have been generally less nasty than elsewhere, which is interesting. The Caribbean countries, excepting Haiti, have been trying to do some mobility agreements. South America has two mobility agreements. There are parts of the world where migration is not as political a topic. And in fact, people look at ways of integrating. It is an issue when people feel that their country is the country people are trying to get to. Right, that is where you actually are starting to see the pushback and where it's becoming an issue of identity. And that includes, I mean, the global north, but also Chile, South Africa, other countries that are poles for, because they're relatively more prosperous and have bigger economies than the neighbors. So, Joseph, do you want to dive in on climate change at all? Did this come up? And there's also a question for you, Joseph, about, as you were researching this, I mean, maybe we can go to you on this one, which is, you know, now I'm lost the question here. I will come back to it. There was a question
about the scenes in the desert, right?
Yes, the scenes in the desert. Thank you.
Oh yeah.
Like how you were able to convey so much.
Yeah, let me answer that first, because I see the question right now. I was actually typing an answer to that. Essentially, it's just a lot of preparation before going out, before the shoot, to make working with the actors, mostly online. We just would have these Zoom sessions. This was also during the pandemic. We shot during the early, during the pandemic, shot in two parts. The first part was right in the middle of the pandemic, even before the vaccines came out. So we were doing a lot of Zoom sessions in terms of acting, getting actors prepared. So they had a clear sense of where they were in the story, in terms of the journey, how physically, tired and exhausted they were in different parts of the journey. And since it's a linear kind of narrative, it wasn't that hard to kind of visualize, I guess, in their minds where they were. So yeah, essentially just a lot of preparation in terms of acting. Yeah. The other question about climate change. Yeah, the thing with climate change is it's interesting because it's very hard to kind of pinpoint that reason, because a lot of times it can be oh yeah, I mean, people are traveling because they've had drought for 3 seasons, and the family farm that they've been working on is not arable anymore, and they don't see that as being related to climate change. They just see that as they just can't survive anymore. You know what I mean? So for to have this very kind of clear connection between climate change and migration, unless it's a specific incident, which is not normal case, it's something which is long gestating. So that's what I find with climate change. It's just difficult to quantify and just to kind of pinpoint, But I feel it's going to be probably the biggest driver coming up in the immediate future of people migrating.
Yeah, I would recommend some of the work being done by my colleague Lawrence Wang, actually Huang. He's been looking at climate change, and what we're finding a lot is there's some areas that are becoming unsustainable around the Sahel, on some islands, and coastal areas, Bangladesh, the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, but in many other places it interacts with other drivers for people leaving, and to Joseph's point, people don't. I actually spent some time in Huehuetenango in Guatemala trying to ask people about climate change. I was there for something else, but I figured I would ask about climate change. I spent a day, like an idiot, asking about climate change and getting, no, eso no la tenemos aquí. No, we don't have that here. Que se hace en la capital. Like, that's a weird thing you're asking, right? And then until the next day I started asking about water, actually, in rainfall, and realized how people understood it was in terms of rainfall, right? And that rainfall, it says, oh yeah, I mean, we used to, it's always been a little unpredictable, but now we have entire seasons that are dry and entire seasons that are where we get massive hurricanes, 2 or 3 in a row. That's different than in the past, and the evidence actually supports that, right? And so it is, for many people, climate change is not a standalone variable. It's part of precarious. There are places that are becoming completely unsustainable. That's visible. But for many people, it just has taken people that were already on the edge, right? And sometimes would fall over the edge. I mean, there would still be seasons where they couldn't produce something. It has really just increased the cycles, and then increased the cycles of indebtedness as well. So it is in many places in the world adding to the pressures. I would throw out, however, that one of the reasons why you're seeing more concern about movement is that people also have more agency to move. I mean, there's more attempt to stop them, but the reality is, I mean, thanks to people having this device, the phones, and there being actual connected flights, many places that did not exist before. There are ways that people can move, and that is also something governments need to think about, right? And people that care about this, because people will find a way of moving in ways that people could not have imagined a journey from many places in the world beyond maybe the capital city or the regional capital or maybe the next country over, can now imagine a journey to another continent, right? And that's not going away. And so, we are in a world of mobility. The question becomes, how do we get ahead of that and create the pathways for people to move, right, that are actually work? So, other questions that people want to dive into here? So Joseph, do you want to take, so you did this movie, what reactions have you gotten from it? Tell us a little bit about what you hear. You've done some showings around the country.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much so far, like, the screenings have been in very friendly territory, you can say. Like, people who are, open to this idea of like immigration, and that's the people who come out and watch the film. I've had like very few people who have been like very opposed to this idea of migration, kind of like watch the film, and yeah. So far, but I've had like a few people, give me like their take about how this kind of like changed the perspective in a way, because a lot of people who do not agree or have some kind of disagreement with the idea of migration and what's driving people to migrate is because they don't know anybody in their lives, like who's done the journey. So yeah, so I must say, Andrew, that the reaction has been nothing surprising in a way. Yeah.
Okay, let's say we wake up tomorrow and, or we go to bed tonight, Donald Trump has been elected president, and we're talking about mass deportation of people from the United States. So independently of how people think about who is the best candidate, and, we have an international group here also attending, so we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of politics, but on that particular point, what happens if we go down the pathway of mass deportation? This is something, I think we're also looking at shades of this in other countries around the world, right? I mean, no one is quite doing it in the same way, but I would be surprised if you don't get an effort on this in the US and it doesn't have an echo in other places.
I mean, for me, like, well, what's if they even achieve like a even close to what they're threatening to that they'll do, it's just going to be complete economic chaos, because the U.S. economy is so dependent on undocumented labor, right? From like what he said, like everything that people eat, as so many industries are so dependent on undocumented, and there's no way that the economy can survive, like a sustained deportation thing. So what's going to eventually happen is, they're going to deport a lot of people, but causing so much, turmoil and so much chaos and so much hardship for so many people, but making sure that the economy doesn't go south. For example, I have this like crazy, I mean, I talk about, so, remember when the pandemic happened and Trump declared, the first thing he did was make farm workers, people who work in like meat production, people who work in industrial farming, all of them to be, they were full forced,
Workers, essential workers, right?
Exactly. They were immediately termed essential workers and had to show up for work the next day, right? Everybody and they were all undocumented immigrants who had to go back to work the next day, and so many people died, like working in the in the meat production establishments and all those like farms. And so I mean, it just shows that people know how important these people are to our economy, but at the same time they don't want to do anything to kind of help legalize their status. It's just this weird situation.
Is this debate happening on the other side, May, as well, on the other side of the pond?
Yeah, I mean, certainly during the pandemic, it was the same as what Joseph just described. It was interesting because actually, I mean, I was reporting on it a lot of it at the time, how it was often the undocumented workers who were the ones who are still having to go to work, which I think really highlighted how crucial these workers are for like keeping things going. I mean, they really are essential workers a lot of the time. What was the initial question again? I've actually completely forgotten.
About the idea of deporting people that were already in the country.
Okay, yeah. Which I guess, yeah, I mean, in the UK, there's a real effort now. Interestingly, I mean, we've just gone from Conservative to Labour, so a more like left-wing party, but it's yeah, I was really kind of intrigued to see how things around migration policy and asylum policy would change. But the reality so far, and it's been a few months, but not much is changing as far as I can see. There's a bit more effort to speed up the decision-making process on asylum claims. But Labour's actually really trying to deport more people, because part of the problem under the Tories was that people were just languishing, waiting for so long for a decision on their claim. So that was kind of meaning that more and more people were having to be accommodated during that time because they couldn't work and so on. But I think it's a different situation in a way, because there's like in the UK, there's like an undocumented community for sure. But then there's like people who have come and are like in immigration detention and are going to, they're seeking to deport. So I think like basically, yeah, they're also not deporting people in high numbers, and partly because it's a difficult thing to do, and it's difficult to forge deals with other countries to actually be able to return people to those countries. But yeah, for sure, it's an interesting time in the UK because we've got this more left-wing government in now, but actually I think they're too scared. Maybe there's certainly people in that party who want to have more progressive migration policies. But the thing that I've come to realize in recent months since they've been in power is that I think they're scared that they might lose voters if they do start to bring in more progressive policies. And, one of their big things is like smashing the gangs. So it's all about going after the people smugglers who are facilitating the crossings over the channel in small boats. But like that's already kind of been tried and it doesn't really work, because as soon as you smash one gang, you get rid of one gang. People are so desperate to get to the UK, they just find another way. And like that business model is going to be, I think, impossible to get rid of until you create more legal routes. And a lot of people crossing the channel, you know, some are certainly economic migrants, but actually a lot of them are Afghans and Syrians and, you know, Yemeni and people who genuinely are at risk in their own countries. So, you know, they can't be deported. But I think, yeah, it's slightly kind of depressing in a way, seeing that nothing's really changing under Labour, and actually the kind of hostile policies seem to be continuing.
Although it may be interesting to see if there's changes on legal immigration, because I think people do distinguish between those things. We're getting into the end of this discussion, so let me go back to Celina and then the final word to Joseph. Anything you want to add that hasn't been discussed yet here? So, or if you have a crystal ball, a bola de cristal.
No, I have no crystal ball. I do think we need to find ways across opinions and parties. We need to find ways to make things more relatable, I think, because I feel like we're just not able to engage in any sort of conversation about this. And I'm trying to, that's not to say I have the answer to it, obviously, but I just do think we need to find ways to, so people can understand what, you know, what the conditions are that lead people to leave, really, like understand them in a relatable way. And maybe that just means like in different conversations that are that we try to make less political and just more human, right? Like, how do we actually speak in a way that can connect with people, that won't just turn them away from it? Because we definitely have a lot of work to do in this, and I think it's important. And I agree with Joseph on the economic piece. I think if there were mass deportations, I think it would be really tough for the economy. And I think logistically, it's really hard to just start knocking on doors. And I'm hoping that if that's the case, there are going to be many more sanctuary cities that really move, and that the citizens of these cities and the country really moves to protect people. So I'm being optimistic and hoping that doesn't happen, and believing it's not going to happen.
Thank you, Celina. Joseph, you have the final word before Alan, and then Alan actually has the final word because he's our host. So, Joseph.
Yeah, I'm quite pessimistic about anything happening. In terms of, I feel like the status quo of, yeah, it's just going to be, we're just going to just keep going down this path of just increased security and border enforcement, rather than actually trying to find like a human solution, because that is a really hard thing to do. And I don't think our politics and our society, at this moment at least, we are capable of making any kind of like rational decision, you know. So I'm sorry, I'm pessimistic about it.
Let me just say before I go back to Alan, I'm a little more optimistic overall in the future, because I think we will have to find our way out of this, and we will, but I am not necessarily optimistic in the short term. And I do think that over time we're gonna have to find ways for people to be able to move in legally sanctioned ways, because it is going to be a question of the destination countries needing that, actually, more than for the good of the migrants themselves. I mean, I think self-interest is often a powerful motivator. Values can be as well, but you know, self-interest combined with values is your best combination. And so I think in the long term, things may work out, but in the short term, it may be a really rocky ride getting there. But Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Just three really quick things. Since we started with the film, I'm going to end with a film recommendation. 2004, A Day Without a Mexican. It wasn't a particularly great movie, but it did make the point that in fact, Joseph, you were referring to. Two, Celine, I want to pick up on that strand. We spend way too much time talking to ourselves and way too little time talking to people that think differently. And part of what Tällberg is trying to do is to talk to people who think differently. We don't always achieve it, but it's certainly a core mission. But we got to do a better job. Someone at dinner the other night said, "Boy, I wish I knew somebody who voted or will vote for Trump, because I'm trying to figure out why they would vote for Trump." And nobody at that table, other than one person, had ever met a Trump voter. And that's way too common in way too many rooms that I think all of us spend time in. And thirdly, then, I just want to thank all of you for this conversation. I think it was a terrific conversation. it got us, although, Andrew, I've got to say, you did manage to say the T word. I was trying to avoid the T and the H word, at least for an hour and 15 minutes, but you did use them, but not very much. So again, thank you all. Thank you, the audience, for tuning in, for your questions. If there's any questions we didn't answer, I will ask our colleagues to try to answer them somehow. And we'll see you next time. We're going to be doing this next year much more frequently. We're going to do at least, if not every month, every other month, a webinar on a major issue, and see if we can't get some of the conversation that Celina wants us to have going more intently. So again, thank you very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.